Hello, students. Let us resume our lecture on history of English literature, Anglo-Saxon period. And in my previous lecture, I have discussed about the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period and the socio-political perspective. And now uh, I have to begin with the history of English literature. So, from Anglo-Saxon period, I have taken the first lecture, the Anglo-Saxon elegiac poetry. But before going to that, let us begin with the Anglo-Saxon poetry in general. As you can see in this particular slide, that in Anglo-Saxon poetry or under the group of Anglo-Saxon poetry, we can find three major sections. The first one is Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry. As you can see, that as we are dealing with the groups of Anglo-Saxon, and as I mentioned in my previous lecture on history of English literature, that in the Anglo-Saxon period, the Angles and Saxons and Jutes, these are the three tribes who are being summoned to save the Gaelic or Gaidelic tribes from the external pressures or external invading countries. So that's why but fundamentally you will find that in the temperament of these persons there are something related to war. That means the battle or they are the warmongers to some extent. Okay, they are the warriors to be specific. So fundamentally, we can find here that if a particular race is being governed by the matter of heroism, then certainly there would be some kind of verses that can deal with that particular heroism. And that's why there is the basic resurgence to Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry. At the same time, you will find that there is Anglo-Saxon religious poetry, as you know that side by side there is a reference to religion. Okay, whether it is the pagan religion or the Christian religion, because at the time you will find the 598 there was the Christianization of England has officially begun. So ultimately, you will find that the Anglo-Saxon religious poetry can also be divided or differentiated into two major sections. One is called the Anglo-Saxon pagan poetry, and the second one is called Anglo-Saxon Christian poetry, as it is visible from this particular section. So fundamentally, the last thing that lies behind it is the Anglo-Saxon elegiac poetry. Probably you will find that so far as the patterns of poetries are concerned, you will find that ultimately, so far as the poetry is concerned, you will find there are ample provisions of different kinds of poetry, and under that particular division, there is one that is called the lyrical poetry. And under lyrical poetry, there are the odes and elegies and sonnets and ballads. So ultimately, whenever you will deal with the elegiac poetry, you have to keep it in mind that elegiac poetry is a part of lyric poetry. So ultimately, in elegiac poetry, there is a particular kind of a resurgence to emotions and feelings and etc. So these are fundamentally the three patterns of poetry that are to be treated under the Anglo-Saxon poetry in general. So let us come to discuss Anglo-Saxon elegiac poetry. What do you mean by elegy? Okay, here you will get a kind of a definition that have been provided in Greek and Roman literature, as it shows. Elegy denoted any poem written in elegiac meter. So that is the first definition. You can see that today, when we try to discuss the elegiac poetry or elegy, we find that elegy denotes any particular kind of a poem that actually deals with any kind of loss, right? A loss and suffering and anything else. So, but in the ancient form, in the at the beginning, it didn't mean so. You will find that in Greek and Roman literature, that is called the Greco-Roman literature, elegy denoted any particular poem written in elegiac meter. Keep it in mind. That is written in the form of hexameter and pentameter lines. So this hexameter and pentameter lines, justifically, you will find that these hexameter and pentameter lines are actually being associated with the metrical arrangements of these poems. So they considered that what we consider today, that elegy must have some reference to loss and separation and anything. But in the ancient definition, we cannot find that particular thing to be present, right? So anything, any particular poem that were written in hexameter and pentameter lines alternating, these were considered to be elegy at the time. Now, the term was also, however, to refer to the subject matter of change and loss frequently expressed in elegiac verse form, especially in complaints about love. So, you will find here the change and loss has been introduced. But keep it in mind that in the ancient form, whenever you will write anything that deals with change and loss, that cannot be or could not be considered as elegy. But if you have to write an elegy, then you have to choose the subject matter of change and loss, and then you have to choose the structure of hexameter and pentameter lines. Then only this can be considered. This could be considered as an elegy. Now, the situation actually changed. You see that age by age, the definition actually changed. Uh, so let us skip a bit. You will find that what happened actually in between. Uh, what happens, that in Europe and England, the word continued to have a variable application through Renaissance generally. Okay, as for example, John Donne's elegies are there, written in the 16th and early 17th centuries. These are undoubtedly considered today as love poems, as we see. And although they relate to the saints of elegy as lament, and many of them emphasize mutability and loss. Okay, and then you will find that in the 17th century, the term elegy began to be limited to its most common present usage. And what is that? A formal and sustained lament in verse. Okay, a formal and sustained lament in verse for the death of a particular person, usually ending in consolation. So these are the modern scenario. Okay, in the modern scenario, you will find the same thing is in operation, and it began with the 17th century. It must have to be a formal verse, it must have to be a sustained lament. Okay, and it was written after the death of any particular person, usually ending in consolation. So, following this particular form or following this particular lines, we can find that the famous examples are W.H. Audens in memory of W.B. Yeats, Lord Alfred Tennyson's In Memoriam, Thomas Gray's elegy written in country churchyard. So these are the famous elegies. But there is another sub branch, as you can see. I will discuss about them later when I will discuss about that particular term in detail. That is a form called pastoral elegy, and you will find that under the group of pastoral elegy, the most important example was the example written by John Milton, and that was Lycidas. Yes, so that is the thing that I should say here. So let us think about the Anglo-Saxon elegiac poetry. So ultimately, these are the patterns. You see that these are the main important texts that are traced to be considered as Anglo-Saxon elegiac poetry, and under these you will find the wanderer, the seafarer, the wife's complaint, Widsith, the deer's lament, the husband's message, wolf and Iduasa, and the ruin. Okay, so it will be continued, it will be resumed in our next class. Thank you.